Hello, welcome to our videocast focused on insider risk. I'm Sarah Keeling, a partner with the global advisory firm StoneTurn. I'd like to introduce you to our panel of experts who will be discussing today the heightened challenges around insider risk. First, we have Jules Parke-Robinson, Global Head of Security Risk Management at a global tobacco company and previously Head of Security Investigations and Resilience at Helen. We are also joined by Helen Gripton, Human Rights and Social Impact Lead for BP and formerly the Insider Risk Programme Lead. And finally, Richard Mackintosh, Senior Advisor with StoneTurn, who was previously set up the Insiders Programme for BP and now advises businesses on insider risks. Just before we begin, I'd like to set the scene. The risk landscape from 9 months ago, when we first did our GIR webinar together, has changed pretty dramatically. We not only have the continuation of the Ukraine-Russian war, we have aggression from the Middle East, issues arising over AI and security around energy issues. So I think we're going to focus today on looking how the landscape has changed and how these challenges are now being faced by our experts. So firstly, I'd like to turn to Richard. So Richard, 9 months on from our GIR webinar discussion on insider risk, what's changed and where are we now?
Well, that's a very good question, Sarah, and a lot has changed. And I suppose I would have two kind of buckets around this. One is lots of things have changed, and in some of these nothing's changed. So the things that have changed, I mean, you've referred to them already, really, around a really challenging geopolitical situation, and that's developed rapidly and in ways that weren't expected. So we've got that going on. We've also got still kind of the run out from the pandemic, the economic consequences of that, and some of the security consequences as well. So things like remote working, how organizations are thinking about those. There are still quite a lot of challenges in that space. And I suppose the other thing that really strikes me in the last few months since we spoke is how AI has just become this dominant conversation in all sorts of different ways. And obviously there are huge benefits to that, and we can start to see in things like medical science what some of the potential benefits are. But I think it's also raising questions for people and organizations on things like, what does this mean for me? What does it mean for us as an organization? So I think there's a lot of change going on in the background. I think the thing that hasn't changed really is insider risk, in the sense that it's been around since we've had people working in businesses and organizations. So that hasn't changed. But what you described in terms of the sort of challenging geopolitical situation, I think is making that much more a central issue. What I'm pleased about, I think, is that I see a greater focus on this, a greater attention on it. And I think organizations are starting to understand it better. And I think that's a great thing. And we see insider cases right across sectors in all sorts of different ways, and people doing different things. So I think traditionally there was quite a narrow view of what insiders were. It was a spy, it was something like that. I think people now understand it better in the sense of it could be fraudulent activity, it could be theft of IP, it could be leaking of data, it could be sabotage of your system. So I think there's a broader appreciation and therefore a better focus on it.
But actually, what sort of cost has there been? I mean, with these increased activity and increasing amounts of insider threats, what does that mean in terms of cost to reputation, to investor relations, to reputation? Can you say something about that?
Yes, certainly. I mean, there are obvious costs. So if someone defrauds you, there's a cost in pounds or dollars of how much you have lost. But actually, the reality is there's some really quite difficult costs to assess. For example, your reputational damage. How do you manage that or put a cost on that? Or investor confidence. So you might be in an organization where you're going through a funding round, for example, and you have some significant leakage of information or loss of IP. which could critically damage investor confidence. And you wouldn't necessarily know that that's happened, but the reality is you don't get the funds that you require. There are numbers put on this and reports are put out. So I think the Ponemon Institute produced something this year on cost of insiders. They take quite a cyber-centric view of this. They don't see all the activities as inside things that I talked about before. They take a cyber view. But I think what comes out of that is the incidents are being more reported and they're expensive and it takes longer to remediate them. And as a consequence of that, organisations are thinking we really ought to have a programme or a function which is specifically focused on insider risk.
Thank you. Jules, can I put that first question to you as well? What's changed for you?
Yeah, I think what's been really interesting is that, as Richard said, there's that huge recognition that there is a problem. But amongst other competing priorities in a corporate organisation, certainly with a security lens on, it's still not getting the traction and the buy-in from a leadership level that it really deserves. And there's that failure to acknowledge that it's a problem, that it can happen to us and to our organisation. And therefore, there's not necessarily the resources that are allocated to insider risk programs to really have that holistic approach. There's often a focus that's very much on data loss prevention, but not recognising that actually the biggest risk here is people and it's human behaviour that causes the problem.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And Helen, can I have your thoughts as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're seeing a shift and a steady, slow but steady shift in the language around insider risk. So whilst we haven't seen a change to the risk itself, and nor would I really expect us to, I think we are having slightly more success in some industries in introducing it to senior leadership, in reframing it, as Richard says, to be a broader church of topics than the perhaps classical fraud, data loss prevention approach. And I think we will hopefully be moving to a place, particularly as these conversations progress, where it will be more noteworthy not to have an insider program than to have an insider program. And I think, just to pick up on one of Richard's points about AI, I think it's very important that we are distinguishing between AI, which I think probably all of us are using on a day-to-day basis, but also generative AI, and how that in some ways is able to put people in places where they weren't, or remove them from places that they were, perhaps, if we look at the simplest applications on photos and phones and so on, and how that can be tackled is going to be a really big topic moving forwards.
Yes, thank you. So my next question, I'm going to come to Richard again. Bad luck, you're starting again. How do you navigate the paradoxical relationship with countries on one hand who might try well to leverage insiders as a way to acquire data or to spy on a country and try to get hold of IP and R&D information, or to act as agents of influence? How do we manage that commercial relationship on one hand, diplomatic relation on the other hand, whilst at the same time understanding that there may be risk of you being hurt by that country?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question that we get asked quite a lot, and I think the first thing to say is there has been a lot of coverage. So the ISC report, which came out in the summer this year, was really clear about the threat posed predominantly by China, but it's not exclusively by China, and people need to be sort of understand that we're not just talking about one nation here. And then comments by Ken McCallum, the Director General of MI5, which reinforced all of that. But I think the key thing is that this is not an either or choice. It's not you can or you can't. It's the reality is China is the second biggest economy in the world and people have to engage. I think the approach that people need to take is think clearly about what are the risks of engaging, and ask yourselves questions such as, do we know what our crown jewels actually are and where they are? And what's the stuff we really genuinely have to protect? So you can engage in a sensible way, but be mindful of what the risks are. So it gets away from this sort of rather binary choice that I sometimes hear of, we either can or we can't. No, you can, but understand what the risks you are that you're running, and then have appropriate mitigations in place to deal with that risk.
Thank you. Helen, may I put the same question to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with Richard. I think nation states getting a more of a focus from senior leadership. It's perhaps a little bit better understood because of the sort of public discussion around it. And there's an increasing pull around what the threat may look like and a desire to understand it as a result. That said, I think it needs to be a realistic conversation. And as Richard said, we need to understand what the crown jewels of information are, but also perhaps have an acceptance that if we're working in partnership with nation states, many organisations are, that there will be a certain amount of data that has already gone out of the door, realistically. And as such, it needs to be a risk-based approach in terms of protecting your crown jewels, to use Richard's phrase, but equally not perhaps trying to close the door after the horse has bolted and protecting information that either has lesser value or has perhaps already been exfiltrated, because I think that can distract from the actual getting after the rest of the programme, and too heavy a focus on trying to protect information that perhaps isn't particularly sensitive can really bleed personnel away from focusing on the risk.
I think that's very interesting. I think also if I could comment from both your answers, that we're living in a world now where relationships between governments and businesses, it's more of an archipelago of relationships. You can be a client one minute, a competitor of one particular country, particularly say in the mining sector, and a joint venture partner. And you see that often with very large global businesses. So thank you. That's a very interesting point you've all raised. So do different sectors behave different internally? And I guess this is partly a cultural question, but it's also, I think, and it's not just about the culture of the organization, but often how different companies internally view insider risk and whether they've really acknowledged it or not. And Jules, I'd like to start with you in that question. You've recently been in two very different sort of companies. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're completely right, Sarah. So it's not just about that acknowledgement of the risk, but also that level of risk acceptance. So working in the sort of the healthcare sector, very empathetic culture, that assumption that everyone is there with the same sense of purpose and that everyone has good morals and is a good upstanding member of the community, and therefore there's not the acknowledgement necessarily that there could be a risk, and therefore the risk acceptance level is almost immaterial. And then moving into a different sector like tobacco, where actually traditionally you could argue that there have been different levels of confidential information. So where is the risk coming from, and identifying what that is has been very different and probably slightly more challenging. And so, and again, a different culture, which perhaps has a harder edge to it. So more acceptance of risk and, that's okay, we can live with it. But I think for me, and both recent roles, very much organisations on a transformational journey. And when we talk about crown jewels, actually understanding what the information and what's confidential, what do we actually need to protect, and then understanding what that risk is and what our level of acceptance is. That's a hard thing, and it's also not static. So it's constantly evolving, and something that we need to have that engagement and dialogue at the most senior levels of leadership, so that the risk is, absolutely mitigated if that's the program that we want to introduce, and in that multiple and holistic way, so that it's not just about cyber tools, it's broader than that. It's how do we go from that entire hire to retire cycle for the onboarding to the offboarding and everything that sits in between.
And that's so true. And I think we talked last time about how risk itself, the threat, the risk is adaptive, it's holistic, it moves quickly. We too have to respond to that and accept that that's the world we live in, and we have to be very agile and nimble in the way we look at the threat picture. Richard, you've now worked in a number of businesses where you've created insider risk programs for them. What's your perspective on this question?
If I think about different sectors, I think if you look at financial services, because they're a highly regulated environment, they will have a lot of technology tools which are looking for anomalous behavior. But of course, they're not completely fail-safe, even though they're very advanced tools. And if you think about cases like Kweku Adeboli at UBS or Jerome Cavil at Societe Generale, who took, I think, $2.3 and $4.9 billion between them, they were working in environments which were highly, highly regulated with a whole suite of technology tools. And one of the things we know about Abadoli was he knew what the tools were and he knew how to circumvent them. So as he was doing these illicit trades, he was moving them on just in time before the system could catch him. So yes, technology has a key role to play, but I would always say, as you used the word earlier, a holistic approach is the one, because this is where things like a speak up culture can really, really help. So I would say to people, whatever sector you're in, yes, you want some technology tools, and some sectors will have a lot more technology than others, but that needs to be reinforced with all the other things that you do around physical security, your people work with the HR team and all that kind of stuff, and having a great speak up culture, because we see regularly that there are cases where people are working in regulated environments, but they get away with things until it goes horribly wrong. And then someone comes out and says, oh, I knew there's something wrong about what so-and-so was doing, but they haven't spoken up about it. And that feels like a bit of a gap in the process. So all of these different things need to be working in concert together. But you do find different sectors, and within sectors, there might be, as Jules was referring to, different sort of cultural acceptance of particular kinds of things. So there are some places in the world where you can do more from a technology point of view or less. And if that's the case, then if there's less you can do from a technology point of view, you need to be thinking about, okay, what other things could we do in terms of physical controls, in terms of line management, in terms of speak up culture?
That's very, very helpful. Helen.
Some organisations are very much more comfortable already with the digital monitoring. Their people are more sensitised to it, and as such, introducing a conversation about broader insider risk and potential measures to mitigate is more easily landed. And I think there is a broader challenge sometimes in that those organisations can too heavily rely on their digital monitoring and not take the time to really understand their people, really understand the softer side. And as Richard said, things like a speak up culture, making sure that leadership is strong and supportive of any such programme, because I think the majority of cases we've seen tend to point to, at some point in the journey of an individual who becomes an insider, poor leadership being a contributing factor. So making sure that whatever sector, whether more sensitive or less sensitive to the topic, and whatever the organisational culture, there's a broader understanding of the risk that doesn't just rely heavily on the digital side, but also looks at the softer people side as well.
So let's turn to buy-in, in particular, well, both organisational buy-in, but senior buy-in. And I think sometimes there is a perception that insider risk either is confused with other kind of risks like cyber risk, or is not until actually something happens and there is damage done to the organisation. At that point, they realise they need an insider risk. Let's turn to Richard. Can you talk to us a bit about how we can better get buy-in? It's something that we hear a lot from talking to organisations, that people sort of are very interested in the subject, but actually really getting buy-in and taking it seriously. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, sure. So, I think when we go and talk to people, they get it and they understand what we're talking about. And when we're clear about the definitions and the kinds of activities and critically the kinds of impacts that it could have within a business, people understand that and think, oh, we should do something about it. I think the biggest challenge around getting buy-in actually is accountability. If no one's accountable, no one's going to do anything about it. So if you think about cyber, so we go and talk to executives, and we might ask them, for example, if you have a major cyber breach, who's responsible, who's accountable for that? And they'll say, well, that's the CISO or the CIO. And everybody understands that, and that's very clear. If somebody if an individual carries out an act, for example, stealing your IP, who is that that's responsible? Because it falls between a number of different stools. It's a kind of a bit of an HR problem. It might be a physical security problem if they've walked out the door with it. It could be an IT problem. So the first thing is actually getting people, to understand what the risk is for them specifically and have a sense of it and have that risk shared at a senior level. And if someone's accountable for it at the top table, something will get done about it. So I think really that is the key thing. And then within the organisation itself, I think communication of this risk is really, really important about what you say to people inside the organisation about what you're doing. There are occasions when it can get a bit heavy-handed and feel a bit like this is a surveillance society. And actually what it's about is protecting yourself, your colleagues, and the organisation that you work for. So the communication bit, in terms of buy-in from people working in your organisation, you need to get the communication absolutely spot on, because nothing kills an effective speak up program other than people feeling that they're being spied upon or they're not trusted. And that's one of the things that we hear is people won't speak up because they don't believe, for example, that they're going to be taken seriously, or in the worst cases, it'll actually negatively impact their careers. That's an absolute killer. So people need to feel, I understand why this program exists. I understand it's here to protect me and my colleagues in the business, and I understand what my role is within it. So I think top level accountability and clear leadership. And the leadership, when they say we take these things seriously, demonstrably taking them seriously is incredibly powerful. And what I mean by that is people raise concerns, something's done about it, and they can see action being taken. That spreads the message really well. And I think that helps buy-in right across the organisation.
Yeah, thank you. Jules, again, the same question to you about buy-in, but I'd be really interested to hear what you've learnt about where buy-in works or doesn't work, and how you've tackled that.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. I totally pick up on Richard's point about accountability and also about that ownership, because I think that with any insider risk program, there are so many stakeholders that have an element of the program and an element of responsibility within it, but there has to be one accountable owner at the highest possible level to be able to get everything aligned and connecting those dots really across the whole business. And what it can't be is it can't be buried within a singular function. It can't be buried somewhere underneath sort of legal and compliance. It has to be visible and it has to be owned by the business. That's where I've seen it have the most success, I would say. And I think the other thing is, really getting proactive and getting ahead of the curve and understanding that life cycle of what the risk is. Because actually many people will put a program in when something's happened and they'll put the controls in at the end of the process. But actually we need to start at the beginning. So where's the due diligence in terms of third-party vendors that we work with, in terms of individuals or potential employees that we want to bring on board? And how are we then putting the training protocols in place to make sure they understand what all those responsibilities are and what they should be protecting in terms of company information throughout their time. The other thing I think which is absolutely key and where the challenges come in is when you're transforming a business and when you're going through change, and there needs to be communication, and actually people who are involved in insider risk and security need to be brought into those conversations really, really early, because actually, again, you don't connect those dots and you're leaving yourself as a business hugely exposed when, you've got people who might be under consultation, and how do we know where the risks are, both from a physical security perspective and an information security perspective, if security is not brought into that conversation and involved in that process and able to advise the business really on what is relevant and where those risks are. So those are some of the challenges that I certainly have seen in the last few months.
Thank you. And Helen, in your previous role, you were running the insider risk program, so you're very well placed to respond to that question. How did you get buy-in?
I think a lot of it comes down to framing. So you have to know your organisation well enough to know what will resonate as a way of selling the programme. And certainly if you're in an organisation, for instance, where you have a very strong safety culture, it's about keeping people safe. Ultimately, the entire insider risk approach should be about keeping people first and foremost safe, and assets and data. And as such, that can be your hook to get into the organisation, senior leadership, in a language that is more broadly understood. And I think, we perhaps suffer insecurity with previously having been seen as blockers or being seen as the people who say no. And I think we have to change that narrative and be able to change the way we talk to the business in such a way that we are seen as partners and seen as business enablers, and that we are as focused as everybody on keeping everybody in our organisation and our data safe. And that's something that everybody top down throughout the organisation should be able to get on board with. But it's about finding what resonates in your particular organisation to open the discussion about any such programme.
And also getting buy-in, across the T, as it were, of the organisation, from the different sectors who have a vested interest, whether that's HR or IT or business development, finance. Is your experience that people, once they get it, they do buy into it and they do respond to what the programme requires?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes down to it. The onus is on us as the programme owners to make sure that we are able to flex our style, flex our approach, and flex how we frame the risk to different parts of the organisation in a way that they'll understand and in a way that resonates with the culture of that particular part of the organisation. So I do think that it's something that, when explained properly, and moved away from the language of monitoring and being suspicious of the workforce, but moved into a more positive language and framed more positively about proactively keeping people safe, proactively protecting our data, and all the reasons why that's important, really allows anybody in the organisation to understand why it's important. But it is absolutely key that we frame it in the right way.
Absolutely, that's great, thank you. So moving on from buy-in, let's assume it's bought in, but then traction is absolutely critical. And how do you ensure that this narrative about insider risk really does reach different audiences, and also how it resonates across different cultures? Are there great differences, and can we explore some of those? And perhaps, can I go back to you, Helen? I know you've just answered a question, but I'd really like to understand that aspect of the traction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it comes to a very similar point to that which I just made, which is about being able to flex your style. So you need a flexible way of introducing and discussing, and to understand local sensitivities and local cultures well enough to make sure that your style is appropriate. You might have parts of the organisation that have very small teams who've worked together for 30 years, who know each other's families well. So to go in and suddenly start suggesting that there might be people part of our organisation who want to cause us harm and commit fraud, for instance, isn't going to land well in an part of the organisation like that. So you need to be able to find a way to frame the risk in such a way that you don't automatically get shut down the moment you introduce it. Because otherwise I think it can feel a fairly alien concept where teams are very close and have known each other a long time. So you need to sound out how the message is going to land, essentially. And that comes back to having that hook that I talked about, how you introduce the conversation and how you frame it in such a way that you're able to make it an approach that goes across different cultures. And certainly in many organizations, safety is one such way, because I think the majority of organizations seek to have a strong safety culture, of which security is fundamentally part. I think the other key thing, though, is not to have too regional approach or too differing an approach to the consequences and reactions to insider risk when you look at different parts of the organization, because one of the key ways to demonstrate commitment and for parts of the organization to buy in is to understand that there is a pretty uniform, where local laws and employment laws will allow, pretty uniform approach to consequences and ways that the organisation will respond in the event that a risk is found. Because I think nothing undermines faster than feeling like different people, different levels, different cultures in the organisation are treated differently when an insider risk is surfaced. So absolutely key to be able to flex your approach in terms of getting buy-in, but to have a pretty standardized response in terms of how you react to any risks you find or people issues that you find.
Thank you.
I would totally agree with that. And I think I would probably just add in that, there's always a natural tendency for us to trust our colleagues. Nobody wants to think ill of anybody. Yeah. And therefore, how you then get that traction, as Helen said, we really need to think also about culture and about creating an environment where people feel empowered to speak up. Because you can have, the most incredible program, but if people don't feel that actually if they make a complaint, if they're a whistleblower, if they make a speak up allegation, that nothing's going to happen or it's not going to get investigated comprehensively, then they won't be encouraged to do it. So it's not about snitching on your colleagues, but it's about everyone having that trusted environment and a trusted culture, so that if you do get the bad apple, that people are prepared to put their head above the parapet and actually speak up about it.
Yeah, and I think creating a trusted environment is really behind this. It's a sort of running backbone to dealing with insiders. If you create a trusted environment, you're less likely to have people wanting to destroy that trusted environment. Richard, can I hear from you about what you think about that topic?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And the reality is that different cultures, you need to approach this slightly differently. So that might be in certain countries, there are things you can do legally that you can't do in other countries. And you just need to be aware of that. I think one of the things that I've found about getting traction is storytelling. Actually, I think it's incredibly powerful. Mm-hmm. So to give an example of that, we were talking to some people recently, and we were talking about the risks around social media and how it is used by criminals and nation states and all the rest of it. And somebody in the chat box came on and said, precisely that has just happened to me. And I was told, said, please name your price for coming and having a conversation with us. And I think that then everybody in the organization hears that and thinks, crikey, this is actually real. This is not theoretical. Mm-hmm. So I think storytelling is an incredibly powerful way of doing that and giving examples. And I think to Jules' point, the other thing is consequence management and how you manage the consequences when something happens. And I'm a big advocate of, where possible, explaining, that action has been taken against people where they've breached the trust of the organization. And that might be they've been disciplined or exited the organization. That sends a really powerful message about, when you speak up, we listen and action is taken. And now we're going to tell you what we've done, and we've improved our processes. That's a really good thing to be doing, I think. So for me, those are the main things, really. And I think you talked about trust there, Sarah, and we haven't really talked about that much, but insiders fundamentally about a breach of trust. So you've trusted someone to come inside your organization, and they've breached that trust by doing something unauthorized, by stealing data or whatever they've decided to do. And the way to counteract that is by building a high trust environment. And that will then encourage people to feel confident that they can speak up, and that when they speak up, something will be done about it. And the great thing about high trust environments is you get better people, you keep better people, and they're more profitable. And what business doesn't want to hear stuff which is going to make them more profitable? Now, from our point of view as insider personnel security people, what we're interested in is they're more secure organizations, but they also bring all of these additional benefits as well. And where you find that working really well is where different things are coordinated inside your organization. For example, the HR piece, employee assistance program, mental health support, when all of those things are coordinated together with the risk around people, you have a really powerful program that actually helps build trust.
Thank you. Let's turn to a slightly different subject. I mean, it's part of the same subject, but I'm interested about when it's difficult to roll out an insider risk program. And I to that point, I think it's interesting to look at how sometimes there can be tension between the compliance, ethics, and insider function. And Richard, you've not necessarily experienced it, but you've seen it vicariously. Could you talk a little bit about that tension and how you manage that tension, if there is tension?
So I don't think there's two things that should be intentional or mutually exclusive in any way. They should actually be working absolutely hand in glove. And it comes back to this point about building a high trust environment. And building a high trust environment in which people behave ethically is the way in which you do this. If there's a tension, that may be that your communication around this isn't quite right. So one of the things that worries me occasionally is I see quite a bit of focus on some of these new tools which organizations have, for example, to see how productive people are being and how they're spending their time. I worry about that because it says to me, we don't really trust you to get on and do your job properly. And I think that unless you land that in exactly the right way, that can have a really, really unhelpful kind of impact. So I do worry about some of the things I see which are introduced into organizations. So I would be inclined to get more on the insider space around high trust environments, speak up program, that kind of thing. I would be absolutely honest with people about we have a program and be clear what the program's for, and it's about protecting you, your colleagues in this company. And I would give people the channels where they can raise concerns. What I wouldn't do necessarily is over communicate about any technology controls you've got, because as I referred to earlier with some of the people who were carrying out illicit trading activities in the city, they knew what the controls were and they knew how to bypass them. But the existence of a program and what the program's designed to do and how you can help it, I think are the ways in which you really get good traction, and you get rid of this sort of perceived tension that you refer to between insider risk and the ethics and compliance piece. They should be very, very closely aligned.
And Helen, can you add to that?
Probably only in the very succinct way of saying, if there is tension between the two functions, there really shouldn't be for a successful program. I see the two as mutually supportive and utterly interdependent, so they have to be working well together in order to have a successful program.
And Jules, do you have any comments?
What Helen said and what Richard said before her. Absolutely nothing more to add to that. I think we absolutely need to support each other.
Yeah, we've covered it very thoroughly. So we've really explored this issue. It's been very interesting. I'd now like to look at the sort of challenges around getting the balance right between intrusion on one hand, we've touched on this a bit, i.e. having sufficient internal controls to spot those red flags, versus freedom and the onus being on the individual employee to behave well, and how you get that balance right and how you don't terrify the organisation. There's suddenly going to be some sort of huge amount of increase in oversight, which can really play out badly within an organisation. How do you shift that, and how do you get those challenges and get that balance of those challenges? Can I start with you, Helen, on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a need to be very open about any program you implement. It absolutely shouldn't be a secret program happening in the background, because that's where that distrust and the discomfort comes from, because it will eventually come out. And so we've talked a bit about how to land your messaging, why you've got a program, why you're doing it. Absolutely key to get that message right and landed first. And then I think it's very important that any controls you put in place to manage the risk are proportionate and necessary. So look at the risk, assess what you can do to mitigate it, and make sure you're remaining proportionate. And I think we can all be guilty at times of putting layer upon layer upon layer of controls in place, never pausing to think about whether or not we can remove some of that, or whether or not we are over layering the controls we're putting in place. And we have to step back every so often and really check ourselves on that. And a huge part of the balance in terms of the challenges between freedom, intrusion, is about communication. If there is a skepticism, and I think we can probably see that particularly in the younger generation about monitoring, and if your controls are proportionate, you should be able to communicate why they are in place effectively, rather than have people concerned about being watched or monitored in the background in a way that makes them feel uncomfortable at work. Because frankly, that would be pretty uncomfortable for anyone if you felt like you were being monitored the entire time without due cause, or without a desire to mitigate a specific risk that you understand.
That's very helpful. And Jules, what about you? Have you come across these
I think I would add on to Helen's point about communication, that there's also, it goes back to Richard talking about storytelling and training and awareness. So we know that ethical fading is a thing, and that people will start with one small act, which could then, spiral into something that's much bigger. So I think if we can share that as awareness and training, that's really important for people to understand that no one is immune, no organisation is immune to the risk. But I think there's also a danger that all of the red flags currently exist, but they sit in different parts of the organisation. So they might sit within HR, they might sit within finance or IT, but it's like, how do we join the dots? So all we're doing as putting the programme together is actually just putting all those dots and connecting those together. I think there's also a little bit in terms of balance is that some organisations will hide behind privacy as a reason not to accept that there is a problem, or that there could be a problem, because we're not necessarily saying there is. It's about protecting and enabling the business rather than being that blocker. So, and I think, I suppose my final point would be about how different generations react differently to the idea that they are being, or could be being monitored. I think those of us who are a little bit older don't really have an issue in quite the same way as the younger generation, who want all those freedoms and access to different things, but actually, would be the first to really sort of clamp down and be really object to the fact that they might be monitored in any way. So that those differences and how we then present that to our employees is really important. So we have to be open and transparent about what we're doing and why we're doing it.
And that's a very good point, because you may have had some big risk event, insider risk event, that has had huge ramifications for the business. You may not have fully communicated what has happened to the employees. And all of a sudden, there's a whole new insider risk program coming in. How, Richard, may I turn to you? How do you then handle that? And how do you get that balance right?
So Helen used the word, and it is exactly the right word, which is about proportionality. So you don't take a hammer to crack a nut here, and you need to think really carefully about what are we trying to do, what are we trying to protect, what tools do we need, and how do we communicate that. So I think that you need to check yourself from time to time. And my strong advice would be, do not leave this just in the hands of security people. What I always strongly advise people to do is have a working group of people who become your kind of critical friend for whatever you're trying to do. And in that working group, I would have your people from HR, your legal people, your IT defense, your physical security people. And part of that is thinking about, okay, so we have some principles which we're operating under, and one of those is proportionality. Is it reasonable? Would it be reasonable if we said to someone, we're going to introduce this kind of control or this kind of monitoring? How do we think people would feel about it inside this organization? Because it might be they absolutely wouldn't, and they'd think that was completely disproportionate, which is a good bit of feedback. You might not want to do it. Yeah. So I think when you're creating these things and launching these things, think really carefully about how would a member of staff or one of our contractors feel when we tell them that we're going to do this, and really think about the proportionality issue, because sometimes you don't need particular kinds of controls and monitoring, and in other places you absolutely do, and you need to be really clear about them. But I think having a working group, and the other thing that does for you is, Jules referred to it earlier about connecting the dots across your organization. This is a risk that sits not with one bit of the organization, it sits right across the organization. And the more that you can involve people to think about it as a risk and then think about proportionate controls, the better the outcome will be, because you'll be testing as you go.
Thank you. I'd like just to say a few words to sum up what we've been saying. I think we all have concluded that insider risk programs are no longer really just a nice to have, that we really do need to have them, but also through having an insider risk program, you can better navigate the risks and relationships that you have both with sectors, competitors, other countries, even actors that are not necessarily thinking about you in a very positive way and might try to steal from you. So you've got a situation where you have an opportunity here to manage those risks. And actually, the better you do manage these insider risks, creates more opportunities for you in terms of commercial imperatives that you have to pursue. So you don't have to be a huge organization. I think the word someone used was it's scalable. It's the same principle for a large organization, an SME, or even a very small outfit. At the end of the day, it's your crown jewels, your data, your people, your IP, and really with an insider risk program, it's probably the best way to mitigate the risks of losing those crown jewels. Anyway, thank you everybody for your time. This has been a very interesting debate. And if you'd like to discuss any of the issues raised in this video cast, please do get in contact with us. Thank you.